Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our presentation today, Women and Leadership, Assertion and Perception, presented by Professor Elizabeth McClean of the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona in collaboration with Ivy Exec. My name is Niatu Benciential. I'm the Senior Content Manager here at Ivy Exec, and I'll be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I do have a couple of very brief housekeeping items to review with the audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to participate in the session by asking questions to the presenter. You can do so using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, located on either left or right-hand side of your screen. We also do encourage questions during the presentation, and there will be a formal Q&A session at the end. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now, I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Professor Elizabeth McClean. Elizabeth joined the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona in 2014 after earning a PhD from Cornell University. Her areas of expertise are leadership, strategic human resource management, teams, and employee voice. She has published research on speaking up in the workplace, employee turnover, human resources practices, and employee performance in the top journals in her field, including the Academy of Management Journal and Human Resource Management, among others. And with that, I'd like to then turn things over to Elizabeth to take things away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I am delighted to be here today talking about women and leadership. As Niatu mentioned, my areas of expertise are thinking about leadership and particularly who is perceived as a leader and why in the workplace. And today I'll be talking about this in relation to how particular change-oriented behaviors like speaking up affect individuals' career outcomes. So thinking about what happens when you suggest ideas for change in the workplace, and ultimately, does that lead you to be perceived to be more leader-like? And is this effect really dependent on whether you're a male or a female in the workplace? So I'm really excited to be talking about this given my interest in this, and I think about these questions on a daily basis, and so I hope that the content is relevant to you, and I look forward to interacting as we proceed. Before I get too far into the content, I want to ask a quick question, and that is, what is your gender? So thinking about how you identify, potentially as a female or a male or a non-binary or a third gender. If you prefer not to say, that's also completely fine, or if you prefer to self-describe. And the reason why I'm asking this question is because the content for today is certainly about thinking about speaking up and the effect of whether you're male or female, but I think it's relevant for a broad array of individuals. So I think Niatu has provided you with an option to select one of these 5 options. So I'll give you a second to do that before we dive in.
All right, I'll leave the poll open for just a few more seconds, and most of the audience has voted at this point. All right, and closing up the poll. And here are the results. So 97% of our listeners today are female and 3% are male.
Perfect.
And no one else selected any of the remaining categories.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. So as we kind of dive in, it's great for me to know that about 97% are female, and then for the 3% of male participants, this content will also be certainly relevant as you're thinking about managing a diverse array of employees, and also as a peer to women in the workplace. So what I want to do is kind of orient us and get us all on the same page. So why are we thinking about women and leadership, and why is this a relevant conversation for today? And really this is relevant because of what I call and what others call the pipeline problem. And this is really about the fact that women are about half of the US population and potentially the world population, and we're actually outpacing men in terms of our graduate degrees and our undergrad degrees. And we also are earning about half of all law degrees, about 40% of MBAs, and about 50% of specialized master's degrees. So what that means is we are obtaining an equal or a higher level of education than our male counterparts. But the problem lies in the fact that we are still lagging behind in our representation in leadership positions. And so I look at these stats frequently, and no matter how many times I look at them, I'm always sort of surprised and disappointed by these particular stats. So I just want to get us all on the same page. I think we're aware of the problem, but I think it's really relevant to take a look at some of the numbers. So for example, in medicine, we have about 40% of all physicians are female, but only 16% are medical school deans. In academia, where I sit, about one-third are full professors. One-third of full professors are female, and an equal amount are college presidents. In terms of venture capital, only 6% of partners are female. And if we think about high-tech firms, we've seen a lot in the news about the lack of representation of women in senior leadership positions in this particular industry. And we see, about 20% of executives, senior officers, and management are women in this particular environment. And I think kind of more astounding is, as recently as 2016, 43% of the top 150 highest earning public companies in Silicon Valley had no female executive officers at all. So pretty astounding statistics. Now, if we open that up and just think about the S&P 500 labor force, a little less than half are female. And as you kind of move up the hierarchy here, we see a really substantial drop in the representation of women. So 36% of first or mid-level officers are women. And then you move up to the executive level, and that drops to 25%. And then ultimately, only 6% of CEOs are women. If you're just looking at financial services, it's a very similar story, with only 2% of women as CEOs of those companies. And then last, in the legal field, as an example, approximately half of all associates are female. But then when you look at who becomes partner, it's 1 out of every 5. And in terms of equity partners, it's actually slightly less. It's only 18%. So this is really the pipeline problem. We have a highly qualified human capital pool of female potential employees. But when we think about how they're moving up into leadership positions, we're seeing this really substantial decrease. And so the question becomes, have we made progress? And then, why is this happening? So when I think about this pipeline problem, a lot of times I get people saying, well, but we're doing better than we did before. Or, your generation has it easier than my generation. And I agree with those statements. So we have made progress. If we look at the charts that I have here on the slide, this is particularly US based, but I think you could show different charts that represent an increase in representation of females on a global scale. But I would say that it's still not necessarily enough. So even with this increase, we're still not at those equal levels of holding leadership positions compared to our male counterparts. And this is despite the fact that we are now obtaining the same level of education as our male counterparts. So the question becomes, why do we still have this problem? Why is this pipeline problem still in existence today? And I just want to get a quick assessment from the audience in terms of why you think this might be the case. So there's different options for why this might be the case. And I've laid out 5 different options here. And I should say that multiple choices are actually potentially accurate. But what I want from you is to think about the one that kind of most differentially affects the pipeline problem. Is it that women select different careers than men? Is it that they opt out during their careers, so they start in the same careers but choose to leave for reasons like family or child rearing? Is it that our organizational practices perpetuate inequality, or that women are less capable than men in leadership skills? Or is it that individuals have different expectations for men and women? So take a think on that just for a second and pick the one that you think kind of most differentially affects this pipeline problem.
Great, Elizabeth. The poll is open. This is one that people might need to noodle on for a little bit, so we'll let it run for a little bit longer than the last one.
Perfect.
Okay, I'll give people about 10 more seconds to respond. All right, and closing the poll. Okay, Elizabeth, so here are the results.
Okay.
4% feel that women select different careers than men. 16% feel that women opt out during their careers. The vast majority, 51%, believe that organizational practices perpetuate inequality. No one believes that women are less capable than men, which is very much true, obviously. And individuals have different expectations for men and women, 29%.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, I'm glad to see that we do have some responses across all of these, except for, as Niato said, number 4. So let me just briefly kind of run through these, and then this will segue into the main focus for today. So the reason why I listed these 5 options is because these are reasons that you might hear. So in the popular press, or just talking to individuals about, why are we seeing this lack of representation of women in leadership positions? And sometimes people will say, well, women are selecting different careers than men. And I would say, by and large, that is no longer as much of the case as it was in previous generations. So the stats that I just shared show that on average, women are obtaining similar degrees or obtaining higher education degrees at a higher rate than men. But there are some situations where women are not necessarily selecting the same careers, and I'll just point these out in the US context. So we know about 20% of undergrads in computer science are females in the US, and that's true, I believe, in the UK and Australia. That's not true in, say, India, where it's actually much more equal. So about 50% of college-educated computer science majors are female in that context. And so we can see, on average, women are not necessarily selecting different careers, whereas previously it was the case where women were sort of slotted into secretarial positions or nursing positions. And now we're actually seeing that, we are choosing similar careers to men. So I would say, on average, that's not the case anymore. The second choice was women opting out during their careers. So this certainly does happen. But there's a really interesting study by Robin Ely from Harvard Business School where she surveyed 25,000 Harvard Business School graduates. So these are people who graduated, I believe, from about 1965 until somewhere in the 2000s, and asked men and women to talk about what they valued in their career, what did they want to get out of their career, and then what are they getting out of their career. So do they have subordinates? Do they have profit and loss responsibility? And what are the barriers to them obtaining some of these different outcomes? And what they found was that, on average, women and men wanted the same thing out of their career. So women wanted the titles. They wanted the achievements associated with those titles. But what they found was that men in that particular population actually had more subordinates and more profit and loss responsibilities compared to the same women in that population. And they found that it wasn't because women were choosing to opt out necessarily. In fact, what they found was the women who did choose to leave the workforce did so as a last resort. So they found, they cited actually a great quote from, I believe it was the Deloitte CEO in the 1990s saying, the reason why we don't have women in leadership positions is because they're leaving the workforce to raise children. And what was actually found was those women were not actually leaving the workforce. They were going to alternative companies and alternative careers. And so we don't have substantial evidence that this is necessarily the case. It does certainly happen, but overall that is not the driving force behind these statistics that I shared with you earlier. The third one, I'm actually super happy to see about half of you selected this one. So organizational practices are really what's contributing here. And when I was thinking about what content I wanted to share today, I thought I could do several webinars just on this one point. And I won't be able to dive into it too much today. We'll briefly touch on it. But certainly we know that a lot of our practices, like pay for performance, are perpetuating some of the inequality that we see in career outcomes. And there's some great work by some folks out of MIT, Emilio Castillo, who has looked at some of this and shown that companies that use pay for performance are actually driving inequality in some of their career outcomes for their minority employees compared to their white male employees. And we can think about that across an array of HR practices. And so that is certainly a major factor in why we're seeing these differences in representation of women in leadership positions. The fourth one, I think clearly to this population, it's very obvious that women are not less capable than men. But I will say that maybe many of you heard of the Google blogger, I think it was last year, who blogged about the fact that the reason why there weren't women, in leadership positions in tech companies particularly was because of ability. And that, soon got a lot of feedback from many different people, and really, it doesn't hold its ground. And so we know from lots of different research that that's not the case, that women are equally as capable as men. And so that is not why we see these differences. But, to be clear, some people are still holding this belief. And I think it's important to recognize that that still exists. So the fifth option, so individuals have different expectations for men and women. This is actually what I'm going to be talking about most today. And this is the idea that we have particular roles that we associate with men and women. And we think about those in relation to the leadership role. And ultimately, these expectations differ for men and women, and the overlap of those expectations with thinking about leadership. So we're going to dive a little bit more into that, particularly today. And so the focus from here on out will be mostly on this number 5, but recognizing that some of these other options are also completely relevant in thinking about women and leadership. So when we think about leaders, usually we have some kind of preconceived notions about what a leader actually looks like, or what a leader actually does. And so to get started, I want you to think about what characteristics does a leader have? So just a leader in general. And you have a chat box option, and I think you can, put a couple of adjectives or verbs, however you would describe a leader, and that will get us started in the conversation. So take a bit of time, and we can come back and see some of the different characteristics that you have suggested.
All right, I'll read some as they come in. From Kristen, we have confident. From Merlin, we have problem solver. From Vanessa, honest, fair, even fun. Kathleen feels that their leaders are proactive and take charge. And then we have mentor from Christine. I'll just do a couple more. Assertive from Alana. And patient, confident, understanding, transparent from Cindy.
Great. Yeah. So a lot of those that came up are very often used to describe leaders. So confident, take charge, mentor, assertive. So these different characteristics are part of what I would call your implicit theory of leadership. And so the idea behind that exercise is to think about what do you think a leader looks like? What is your kind of unconscious aware thought of what a leader looks like? And if we were in a group setting, the second part of that exercise would be to get into groups, and I would ask you to actually draw what a leader looks like. And this is an exercise that I use in a lot of my classes, and the purpose of it is to elicit what your implicit leadership theory is. And I've shown here 2 different pictures that are pretty representative of what comes out of this exercise. And so these are picked actually from a New York Times article that was written about some of the research that I'll be sharing later today. And so the one on the left, you can see it looks like potentially a man with large ears, right? And he might have some ideas. He has vision. He communicates effectively. I believe he might be wearing a watch. And then the one on the right, we can see some similar characteristics. So vision, there's order, very well dressed, successful, communicates, good balance, very decisive. And so these different characteristics are often associated with the role of a leader, thinking about what a leader would be like. And why this is important is because oftentimes the expectations of what we have for a leader are not in line with the expectations that we have for women. And so what I mean by this is, on average, our expectations for females are to be soft-spoken, to be agreeable, to be nice. And so it's assumed or expected that a woman would be some of these things. Now, when we think about how that overlaps with our perception of leadership, you can see that the overlap of these different expectations is pretty small. So yes, there is some overlap. For example, I think several of you mentioned, leaders are mentors. And that might fall in line with our expectations for women maybe being kind of more relational. But on average, what happens is our expectations for these two different kind of roles are not necessarily in line in the same way that they would be for men. And so our expectations for male behavior are things like being assertive, being competent, being influential, and those overlap to a greater extent with our expectations for leader behavior. And so ultimately, when we're thinking about, why are women not moving up into leadership positions, oftentimes one of the reasons is because our expectations for female behavior is not in line with our expectations for leader behavior. And so one of the ways that we can think about this is by thinking about evaluation. So when you're evaluating particular individuals, and I like to use some data from actually ratemyprofessor.com as an illustration of sort of thinking about performance evaluations or performance reviews and some of these different expectations based on gender. So I don't have access to, say, an organization's database of the comments written on performance evaluations, but you can think of ratemyprofessor.com as performance evaluations for professors. So this is super relevant to me as a faculty member at the University of Arizona. I am very often evaluated by my students, and what this website allows people to do is go and actually write comments about faculty members, and they can rate how hard the class was, how nice the faculty member was, how attractive the faculty member was. And what this computer scientist Ben Schmidt did was he went and took all of the evaluations of faculty members by gender and by discipline and looked at the words used to describe the faculty members, depending on their gender or discipline. And so just as an example, I have a few of these evaluations, and one is, Elizabeth is really helpful. You just need to approach her. And so what I like to do to illustrate some of these different gender roles and perceptions or expectations is to try the word smart and then the word nice and see what happens. And so I've done this for you here, and just to illustrate this, you can see, so with the word smart, you can see by discipline, the frequency of using the word smart in an evaluation or in one of the statements, depending on whether the faculty member was male or female. And you can see across the board that the word smart is used to describe their male faculty members more than their female faculty members. Now, if we plug the word nice into the program, we can see that the reverse happens, that the word nice is more frequently used for female faculty members compared to male faculty members. And so the reason why these expectations matter is because they drive our perception of behavior within the workplace and what we expect in terms of our male and female colleagues and whether or not we perceive them to be leaders. So thinking about those expectations, what I'm really interested in is what happens when in the workplace someone suggests ideas for change or engages in what I would consider leader-like behaviors, and do other people sort of grant that mantle of leadership to the person who is suggesting these ideas for change? And ultimately, does that matter depending on whether the person suggesting these ideas for change is a male or a female? And so a lot of my research has focused on this particular topic, and so what I'll share with you now is some of that research and kind of break it down in terms of, what are the findings, and then what are some of the things that you can do as a female or as a male colleague to help facilitate reducing some of this bias in the workplace. So taking a step back, imagine that you're sitting in a group meeting. So this would be a gender mixed group meeting. You have some male colleagues, some female colleagues, and a frequent situation that happens is in this type of meeting, the female employee suggests an idea for change. And what happens after she suggests that idea for change? Do people respond to it? Do people mobilize resources around it? Or is it that that idea sort of just gets left on the table, maybe either ignored or just forgotten about? Now, maybe 2 minutes later, her male colleague suggests a very similar idea for change. Do people pay more attention to that? Do they put resources around it? Do they kind of create a collective energy around that idea? Or do they let that idea also sort of kind of go out the door, just like the female idea? And so this was kind of what I'm thinking about exploring. And so to understand some of these dynamics of, well, who is suggesting the idea for change and what happens afterwards, my colleagues and I created a couple of studies to kind of unpack this. And the first one is an experiment. So we wanted to know what happens when a male speaks up versus a female speaks up, and what is the response in terms of who is granted this mantle of leadership. So what we did was we collected data from about 200 working adults. They were on average educated, highly educated, about 40% were women. And what we did was we manipulated the ideas for change. So we call these different types of ideas promotive and prohibitive, and I'll explain in a second what those mean. And we also manipulated the gender. So it was a male voice versus a female voice. And we assessed who was granted status or respect, and also who emerged as a leader. So in terms of these ideas for change, when we think about this particular change-oriented behavior, there's different ways that you can suggest ideas for change. So one way is you can say, I have this future idea for change. I think we should do this because it'll make our group better, versus pointing out problems. So pointing out problems is really saying, hey, we need to stop this right now because this is causing harm. So what we did was we pretended to have an insurance company. So we created this kind of fake insurance company and said, you're in a group meeting in this context, and one of your colleagues suggests an idea for change. And it was either ideas for the future, that's promotive voice, or it was either pointing out problems, which is prohibitive voice. So to give you an idea of what that really means, I've put the content of the ideas here. And I think it's actually worth reading through because it shows the nuance of these different types of ideas for change. So on the one hand, on the promotive voice, what happened was the colleague was suggesting that the script that was used to sell different insurance plans, that would be changed for the future. So I think that we should come up with a new and improved script in order to give us more flexibility in meeting customer needs going forward. My idea is for a new script that could include much more leeway around bundling products for our customers so that we can better meet their needs in the future. I think a new script will help all of us to be better. So that's really saying, here's an idea for the future. That's different from pointing out problems. So on the flip side, I think that we should get rid of this ineffective script because it has restricted our flexibility in meeting customer needs in the past. My concern is that the script makes it much harder to bundle products for our customers and is harming our ability to meet their needs right now. I think getting rid of the script will fix the harm done. So using these different types of ideas for change and thinking about what happens when it's a man suggesting this idea for change versus a woman suggesting this idea for change, we assessed ratings of status or respect and ultimately perceptions of who should be the leader or who emerges as a leader in this context. And what we found was that men who spoke up about ideas, so that's that promotive sense of voice, gained respect and status in their groups, and ultimately were more likely to be perceived as leaders compared to women who spoke up in exactly the same way. There's a nuance to this, though. We also find that men who spoke up in this promotive way about ideas also gained more status and respect and ultimately leader emergence compared to their male counterparts who spoke up about the problems or pointing out problems. And so the chart that you see on this particular slide, the way to interpret that is the two bars on the left side are the ratings of status for speaking up about ideas for men and women. And so the one on the far left you can see is much higher than all of the other bars on this chart. And the way that we think about this is in terms of statistical significance. And ultimately what that means is it's meaningful that men who speak up in this promotive way are getting more respect within their groups and ultimately leader emergence compared to anyone else who's speaking up. So compared to women who speak up in the same way or men who speak up in the more prohibitive sense, or pointing out problems. So this is kind of an interesting result for us, because we're seeing that, you know, men who are speaking up about ideas are really the ones benefiting the most in terms of being perceived as a leader. Now, the beauty of an experiment is you can control for the content of what is said. So we know in this situation, women and men are saying the exact same words. It's just whether or not it's a female or a male voice. And I should note, how we actually manipulated that was we recorded people speaking up. So we had a female record the scenario that I shared with you before, and we had a male record that scenario as well. And so the participants actually listened to the ideas based on whether it was a male or female. Now, the sort of downside of an experiment is it doesn't necessarily have what we would call generalizability. So an experiment is, you know, kind of a false scenario, and it may not actually generalize to the real world. And so what we did was also conduct a field study. A field study is really about capturing real voice behavior, real perception of status, and real perceptions of leadership in kind of a more meaningful way. And so what we did was we collected almost 200, we collected data from almost 200 people at the US Military Academy at West Point. And these particular individuals were participating in a team exercise to train and then compete in what's called the Sandhurst competition. What we did was we followed these teams across time. So we asked early on in the training and preparation for this competition, we asked individuals to tell us a little bit about their speaking up behavior. So how frequently do they suggest ideas for change? How frequently do they point out problems? And then we asked all team members to rate all other team members on the level of respect that they received. And how we did that was, imagine that I gave you a list of your, say, 8 other team members, and I asked you to rate each one in terms of the level of respect that they had in your team. At the end of the competition, we then asked individuals to rank order their team members in terms of who they would like to see to be the leader of the team. And this is really capturing that perceptions of leadership. Who do you want to be the leader the next time that you have to work with these individuals? And what we found was the exact same pattern of results as our experiment. So the way that you can interpret the chart that's on this particular slide is, you can see that the line that represents the men in this context is quite positive. The slope is positive. It's an upward slope. And what that means is men who spoke up promotively about ideas for the future, they saw a substantial increase in the amount of respect that they received in their teams. And ultimately, that respect predicted whether or not they were ranked higher in terms of leader emergence compared to their peers. And the same pattern of results holds in terms of the fact that women were not given that same amount of status or respect because of their voice, and also that men who spoke up in this way gained more respect and perceptions of leadership compared to speaking up about problems. And so we're seeing that ultimately it's about these expectations. So there's particular expectations for engaging in change-oriented behaviors at work. You can think about this in terms of those leader expectations that we mentioned earlier and that some of you actually described. So several of you mentioned, say, taking charge, being assertive. That's really about being change-oriented. And the expectations for those behaviors are really more in line with male, with the kind of male role in society. And so it's more appropriate and accepted for men to engage in these change-oriented behaviors compared to women. And ultimately, that distinction about the promotive and prohibitive is that people like when individuals speak up about ideas that are kind of positive, future-oriented, as opposed to what we would consider kind of more negative or pointing out problems, those types of ideas. So what does this mean? So frequently when I share these results with individuals, there's sort of a sigh or an exhale of kind of unhappiness that these are the results that we're kind of confirming something that a lot of people have either experienced or felt. And I think that is kind of the unfortunate aspect of this, that women who spend time engaging in these change-oriented behaviors are not getting the same benefit or credit for their ideas as men in the workplace. The good news, or you could think of this as good news, is that we didn't find a backlash effect. So oftentimes, what we found in previous studies of thinking about women and their assertive behaviors is that oftentimes by engaging in particular assertive behaviors, women are evaluated in a more negative way. So they actually have a backlash that happens against them. And we don't find that. And I think part of that is because of the nature of change-oriented behaviors. So there's an inherent characteristic about speaking up that it's meant to benefit the collective in some way. So it's kind of a pro-social behavior. And I think that helps mitigate some of that potential backlash effect. But that said, ultimately, our results are highlighting the fact that women are less likely to be seen as change agents compared to their men colleagues or their male colleagues. And so what can we do? That's ultimately what the question is. And so there's a couple of different things that I'd like to highlight. In terms of the managers in the room or the managers on the line, I think it's really important to understand these dynamics. So I think the first thing that we need to do is recognize that even if a female colleague says the exact same thing as her male colleague, that she's less likely to be given credit or to be seen as a leader compared to her male colleague. Knowing that, then in group meetings, you can actually give credit where it's due. So when women are speaking up in your group meetings, you can highlight the fact that they've suggested an idea for change and make sure that there's some time spent evaluating that idea, as opposed to kind of letting it float out the door. On the other hand, I think it's also important for team members to think about this. So certainly as a female in group meetings, I frequently am observing, who is speaking up, who's speaking up the most, or who's talking the most. And what's important is to recognize that when a colleague is speaking up, that it might be a good idea for me to kind of piggyback off of that colleague and amplify their suggestion for change. So what this means is if a female colleague says, hey, I think we need to do this, then I can say, you know what, I think, say her name is Elizabeth, say Elizabeth's idea is really great and I think we need to spend more time and energy around that idea. So that amplification, what that does is it creates a collective energy around it and it legitimizes the idea. So ultimately, if the issue is that our expectations for male and female behavior is not overlapping with our expectations for leaders, we can sort of adjust or shift that expectation by providing some support and energy around the idea. And what that does is it really makes it more accepted in potentially within that group. And I think this is a good strategy for both men and women in the workplace. So it's not just about women helping women, but I think this is really important for male colleagues as well. Now, on the other side, I think one of the questions that I get frequently is, well, what can I do personally as a female in the workplace to make sure that by engaging in these change-oriented behaviors, I am also receiving a similar benefit to my male counterparts? Because ultimately, I don't want the story of these results to be stop engaging in change-oriented behaviors. It's not worth your time or energy. I think the real question is, how can you do that and be more effective at it? So the bad news is the research on gender and influence strategies is really mixed. And what I mean by that is it depends. That's the answer. So what can you do to lean in more successfully? It's going to depend on the situation and kind of the context that you're in. The good news is, I think by learning some of these different strategies or having a sense of what do we know, that you'll be able to pick and choose when it's effective to do so in order to kind of get more credit or gain legitimacy in the workplace for your change-oriented behaviors. So what I want to share is a couple of different tools, a couple of different options for you. And the first one is thinking about the idea of competence. So influence in the workplace is really about competence. So when we're thinking about being perceived as a leader, really what that means is, are you influential in the workplace? And the more competent that you can appear, the more influential you will be. And this is across the board for men and women. So what we know from the research on influence and gender is that women who tend to support their ideas with evidence are seen as more influential in the workplace compared to those that don't. So having those displays of competence is really important to let others know that you are confident in your ideas for change. However, that said, this is where the answer is sort of, it depends. Competence displays tend to be less influential in traditionally male-dominated contexts. So these are contexts where, it's on average more men in the workplace, or the task itself is more associated with maybe masculine qualities. And so you have to know your audience and recognize that too much of that competence display can actually, that's where some of the backlash can occur. Now, I'll talk in a second about how you can sort of navigate that challenging situation. So the second tool is that because of the expectations around female behavior, communality matters. So what this means is women are expected to be more communal, they're expected to be more warm, more sensitive. And so ultimately, women can gain influence by being more collaborative and communal. So by showing that they're more collaborative and communal, and letting others know that actually the purpose of their behavior is really to help others and their own benefit, rather than their own benefit. So this could include, expressing some agreement, showing support of others, or just literally explicitly stating your motivation for why you're doing what you're doing. Unfortunately, self-promotion, highlighting your own specific achievements and disagreeing with others has a more negative effect for women in terms of influence compared to men. So what this ultimately means is, unfortunately, as women, we have to think more strategically about how we suggest ideas for change or how we engage in some of these behaviors, whereas men, just by kind of being in a higher position within society, gain influence without having to think about all of these different particular nuances of their ideas for change in the same way, on average. So combining those two first tools, I think this is really the most important piece, is you need to be able to combine that competence with that communality. So going back to the specifics of the ideas for change, highlighting the collective benefits of what you're suggesting. So this is good for the group or organization because. So highlighting that you're actually suggesting this idea because it's good for your group or the organization, and that you're not suggesting this idea for change just for your own particular benefit. But also highlighting that you're really confident in your idea. So saying things like, I am certain that, as opposed to, I'm not certain, but maybe this is a good idea. Or I strongly suggest that, versus, would it be possible if we were to do this change? And saying things like, I'm confident that, versus, I'm not confident, but maybe we can do this. So the language that you use will actually affect perceptions of how confident you are and how competent you are. So I want to share with you a little bit of research that I've recently conducted that tries to assess, does this work? Does this matter? And so these are not published results, but I want to share with you, I want to share them with you because I think it's really relevant to thinking about what are some of the strategies that you can use. So in a similar way to the experiment that I described before, my colleagues and I manipulated the voice gender, so who's speaking up, so is it a male or a female voice, but ultimately the language used. So in terms of the powerful versus powerless language, what we were thinking about was, in the powerful language, saying things like, I am confident that, as opposed to, in the powerless language condition, I'm not confident, but maybe this is a good idea. So kind of in a more questioning or hesitant voice. And what we found was, in the powerful language condition, the female was actually able to kind of overcome that lack of credit, I suppose you could say, that they received in the other study that I shared. So what we found was women who spoke up in that more confident manner, that their ideas for change actually allowed them to be perceived as more legitimate or more accepted in the workplace. So what this tells me is that it does matter for women how you actually suggest the idea for change. So combining that communal aspect, it's an idea for change, it's meant to benefit the collective, but doing so in a confident manner, that combination has a benefit in terms of getting your voice actually out there and legitimized in the workplace. So given what I've just suggested, these are research results, but at the same time, what I'd like to know is, do they resonate? So what are your strategies for getting and giving credit where it is due? So ultimately, are there other things that you have found actually have worked for you in terms of making your voice heard or helping other people's voice be heard in the workplace? So we'll take a couple of seconds here and think about some of these strategies, and if you're willing, we'd love to hear some of them.
All right, if a few of you can start sending your suggestions in response, I'll read a couple of them out. Lynn tries to find, as she's a consultant, and so she's trying to find a hero within the organization who's a woman leader and coaching her on strategies to use. Kirsten likes to leverage input from other women who are in the meeting. And Tanya puts her ideas in writing. Also, Merlin does the same thing.
Okay, I think all of those are great ideas. I think the first two sort of highlight the kind of collective energy aspect. So creating a team in the workplace, I think that's where that legitimacy comes from, is if multiple people are putting their energy around something, then it makes it more valid. It's harder to ignore also. And I think then the writing strategy is a really great one, because what happens is it codifies the idea. So in that team meeting, following up, sending an email, putting it down in your own words, then it's going to be harder for individuals to ignore that. So I think those are really great strategies for making your voice heard. And ultimately, hopefully, letting your ideas actually create some change in the workplace. So thank you for sharing those. So the key takeaways here are really about this expectation and understanding that individuals have different expectations for men and women in the workplace. And I should note that this is actually true regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. So women also hold these expectations. It's not just men assume women should be soft-spoken or less assertive. It's actually that both genders have these different expectations. And I think a lot of this comes from our society and socialization in the workplace. And these expectations may or may not overlap with our expectations for leaders. And that's where the challenge is how do you navigate that situation, given that individuals will assume or expect certain behavior from you as a woman in the workplace. And ultimately, our results show that men are going to get that bump of status and leader emergence for suggesting ideas for change. And again, the nuance of that is for the 3% of men on this call, and then hopefully the others who take a listen after, that even speaking up promotively or about ideas, that's more beneficial in terms of gaining influence and status compared to pointing out those problems. And then I think the most important thing here is really about, well, then how do you navigate that situation? What can you do differently? And for women, I think it's really about combining the communal aspect with the displays of competence to get it across that you are suggesting an idea for change for the benefit of the group, but that also you're very confident in that idea for change. And unfortunately, men are naturally going to be more influential in the workplace and in society. But I think there's a lot of things that we can do as females in the workplace to help make sure that we continue to move up into leadership positions. So whether that is supporting each other in that kind of collective effort, or whether that's, drawing energy or resources around these ideas for change. And then if you're a male colleague, it's doing the same. So I think we need to partner across genders to make sure that women's ideas for change are also given credit in the workplace. And ultimately, it's not just about women versus men, it's actually about men versus different minorities in the workplace. So a lot of the things that I've shared with you today could be applied to minorities in general as well. So I will stop there and see if there are questions or other comments from the audience.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for a really great presentation. Really appreciate the insights and the stats that you provided. It really kind of helped to shape our perspective, and I hope it's been useful for everyone on the call so far. Please start sending your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I'll prioritize them best I can. Starting with a question from Michaela, which I believe many of the women on the call can relate to. She mentions having a Master's of Science degree, yet whenever group activities come up in her workplace, trips, conferences, workshops, etc., she's often asked to handle the administrative or gender-biased tasks, such as coordinating and organizing. Given her education and her ability, which might be above and beyond those who she works with in many cases, how can she manage to steer herself away from being assigned tasks like this? How can she decline and move on?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. So this is something that happens because of that expectation. So oftentimes women are thought to be kind of more of that relational, more of the caretakers in particular groups. And so what I would say is, if I were in her shoes, I would probably suggest that the role gets rotated. So as opposed to completely saying, I'm not going to do this, or I'm kind of tired of doing this, making it more of a rotated job within the particular group. So what that does is it allows for it to still be kind of this relational aspect, but she can actually focus her energy on other parts of being part of that group, and it won't come across as that disagreement that I mentioned before, where if you just say no or you just disagree, oftentimes that's just going to lead to the backlash effect that you're probably trying to avoid. So I would think about it in terms of suggesting the idea for change as, I think this would be good for the group if we maybe rotated this position, depending on the situation. You could highlight, maybe it's good for many of us to develop the skills, so the evidence that you would use might depend upon the situation, but I think you could build an argument that, well, it is actually beneficial if we rotate this type of position. And so making it about for the good of the group, I think is probably a good idea.
Great. Segueing from the point you made about backlash, I'm going to combine questions from Kay and Dana. The context for both questions is male-dominated fields. Mm-hmm. Dana would like to understand whether or not powerful language would backfire in a male-dominated field. And then if it does, attacking on Kay's question, she's typically used the only female executive. What tactic can she use in that situation? Though she's very competent, can she be seen on the same playing level as the male executives in her male-dominated industry?
So in a male-dominated environment, that's where kind of the biggest chance of a backlash is. And so that's where knowing that audience is really important. So I think that's where you really need to combine that communal aspect. So if you're going to just say, I am confident that, that is going to probably have a backlash effect. Without that, those more communal aspects, I think that's where the challenge is. So it's, how do you be confident, but also show that communality? That's where you have to be able to combine those two in the message that you get across in order to be influential in that environment. And it's going to be far more challenging. So you've got to make sure that you really make sure that people are recognizing that you are suggesting these ideas for the benefit of the group or the benefit of the organization, but that you're also confident in those ideas. And then the second part of the question, can you repeat that?
Sure. So with in case situation as typically the sole female executive dealing with other male executives, what tactics or strategies can she use to be seen as a peer or equally respected within that setting?
Right. Yeah. So I think the answer is very similar. So it's really about the message that you craft and combining those two aspects. In a female-dominated environment, you don't have to worry about that quite nearly as much as in that male-dominated context. But without that communal aspect, I think that's where the backlash is going to happen. So self-promotive, it's not going to go over well, unfortunately, even if it's totally worth, you have done great things or your idea is absolutely fantastic. Without that other piece of it, I think that's where you run into trouble in that male-dominated environment, because unfortunately their expectation of you is that you play this certain role. So you've got to be able to combine both aspects in order to be influential.
Okay, great. We're going to take, I think, maybe two, maximum three more questions so we can get everyone out of here on time. This next question comes from Zara. And in her case, she was taking a role as the director of a department where the staff were initially more familiar with aspects of the department's running versus her own, skill or competency level. I want to tie in the webinar I did 2 days ago about confidence boosting for women. Our presenter mentioned that you need to be okay with maybe a temporary sort of gap in your competence as you grow in your career and learn new things. It's part of the evolution. So inserting that in, Zara would like to understand how can she go about gaining respect in the situation where she might be less familiar, less competent than those she's going to be managing.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in that particular case, I think actually to your point, Niato, that it is okay to say that you don't necessarily have the competence, right? But I think in general, what we know from other literature on the female advantage to leadership is that in ratings of effectiveness, so leader effectiveness is your performance within a leadership role. That's slightly different from what I was talking about today in terms of perceptions of are you leader-like. And in terms of the leader effectiveness part, what we know is that women are oftentimes seen as more effective because they are good at this kind of relational aspect. So what that means is getting input from other people, asking other people for their ideas, being sensitive or considerate of other people's needs. That actually does create an advantage for women in the workplace. And we see that there is an increase in their ratings of effectiveness because of those behaviors. So what I would say in that situation is leverage that expectation. So you may or may not have the natural ability for that, but I would say try and get their input and show that you are considerate of their expertise and that you are interested in them being part of crafting the ideas or the changes that happen within that particular group. So I think you can that actually plays to your benefit to leverage their ideas and bring those in. So that's what I would suggest in terms of kind of thinking about benefiting from the expectation that women are more communal. You can actually play that to your benefit.
Okay, great. And this will be the final question. I'm combining an observation by Tiffany and morphing in the question from Michelle. So Tiffany, actually it's a feeling, is feeling frustrated that women have to temper their abilities and personalities in order to be taken seriously. Tying in Michelle, Michelle has felt that in listening to your presentation thus far, that a lot of the advice seems to be suggesting that women alter their behavior in order to be perceived as leaders. And she's wondering how this might be reconciled with feminism. Might it be perceived as even anti-feminist in that you're asking women to alter their behavior?
Yeah, so literally as I was preparing this, I was feeling the same frustration. And so I was thinking, I like to be who I am across different situations, right? And I don't necessarily want to have to change myself in order to be influential in a particular situation. Maybe I just don't want to be in that situation then. And I think that what I would suggest is there's key elements of yourself that I do not think you should change just based on the situation or to be influential. All I'm suggesting is that the framing of your message or some of the words that you use, that those might help you become more influential. So the inherent nature of the content of what you're saying or what you value, I don't think should be adjusted. But ultimately, if you do want your ideas to be heard, there are some small things that you can do to tweak what you're saying so that other people will listen more. And I think it is kind of an unfortunate aspect of the workplace. And I think that you can choose whether or not you're wanting to make some of these tweaks or not. And ultimately, what I have decided for myself is I'm going to be who I am. And if my core values are being threatened in situations, that's not okay with me. But at the same time, I think that there are some small things that I can do knowing that they might help me actually kind of be my full self within the particular context that I'm in. So I think that's something that is a kind of personal decision. All we know from the research is there are some strategies that you can use to be more influential. And I would hope that you can be influential without being, say, manipulative.
Great, thank you so much for a really thorough set of responses, are really dynamic and engaging. We appreciate the presentation. Thank you to each and every one of you who took the time out of your day to join us, so your morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending where you are in the world. And we hope this has been a valuable use of your time, this collaboration between Arizona's Eller School and IB Exec. For any additional support, continue to stay with IB Exec, check out our online classes. We shall continue to collaborate with Eller. And let me turn this over to Elizabeth for any final words to the audience.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening and to participating, providing your questions. I would really welcome continuing the conversation. So I'll share my email address, particularly if there's anything that really resonated with you, or I think even some of the final questions are really important about thinking this through even more. I'd be happy to continue the conversation. I think this is a really important topic. This is my key area of research. So my goal in work and life is to create content that is relevant and really impactful to people in the workplace. So if there's anything that you think I should know, I'm all ears and willing to listen and to continue the conversation. So thank you so much, and I appreciate it.
All right, take care everyone, and see you soon.